Um, I'm going to talk just briefly about the in-class test on Monday, which is March the 16th. So there'll be some translation into sentential logic. And the only couple of things to look out for. The conditional, if, then. It's sort of when fully written out, it's, if, and a sentence goes here, then, and a sentence goes there, and this is the one that we call the antecedent, and this is the one that we call the consequent. And identifying antecedent and consequent is crucial, because unlike the other three binary connectives, conjunction and disjunction and the biconditional, it matters which way round the sentences go. So the basic rule to follow is what comes after if is the antecedent, but what comes after only if is the consequent. And if you have both of those, if and only if, but only if you have both of them, do you have the biconditional if and only if. So whenever you see if, or something that's doing the work of if, like provided that, or then think about this question as to which is the antecedent that comes after if, which is the consequent that comes after then or after only if. The other thing about, I'm not sure that I've talked much about unless. And clearly, unless is a kind of logical operator, and the question is, what kind is it? He'll die unless he goes to hospital. I say this about someone lying there, and I say he'll die unless he goes to the hospital. What am I ruling out? Well, what I'm ruling out is that he just jumps up and walks off right as rain. I said he'll die unless he goes to hospital, and he didn't go to hospital, and yet he didn't die. And that would show what I'd said was false. Anything else will not show that. Suppose he dies right there. I said he doesn't go to hospital and he dies. I said he would die unless he went to hospital. Suppose he goes to hospital but still dies. Well, I didn't say he wouldn't die if he went to hospital. I just said he would die if he didn't. And equally, if he goes to hospital and survives, I said he would die unless he went to hospital. He went to hospital, he didn't die. So it's clear that it, like the disjunction and like the biconditional, unless is 2 on 3 of the 4 possible combinations of truth values. Which 3 is it 2 on? Well, the same as or. He'll die, or he goes to the hospital. What am I ruling out? I'm ruling out him not going to the hospital and yet him not dying. So really I'm just saying, when I say unless, I'm really just saying or. So replace unless with or and you will get it right. You can of course replace it with a conditional, but now you'll have to probably flip the order of the sentences and stick in a negation. If he does not go to the hospital, then he will die. He'll die unless he goes to the hospital. Flip the order, but add in a negation. If he does not go to the hospital, then he will die. So it's much easier to just treat unless as or. Then, so 3 sentences, 3 arguments to translate using a translation key. Then 4 sentences of which you're asked to determine whether they're contingent or inconsistent or tautologous. So here, first you try and make them true. If you succeed, they can't be inconsistent, because an inconsistent sentence only takes the truth value false. So it's either contingent. If you try to make it true and succeed, it's contingent or a tautology. Now you try and make it false. If you fail, it's a tautology, it can only be true. If you succeed, well, you made it true and then you made it false. It's contingent. So try and make it true. If you fail, it's inconsistent. If you succeed, try and make it false. If you succeed, it's contingent. If you fail, it's a tautology. And then there'll be two invalid sequence. So they're invalid, no question, but they're invalid. And then you have to find at least one invalidating assignment. So I'll just do one of those for you here. So 5 atomic sentences, and we have the first premise is a conjunction of two conditionals where you notice the consequent of the first conditional is the antecedent of the second. A disjunction is the second premise, either not R or not S. The third premise is T, if and only if S. And then the conclusion is neither P nor Q. So we have a conjunction of two conditionals, a disjunction of two negations, a biconditional, and then a negation. And we're interested in whether we can make these three premises true while the conclusion is false. Well, no conjunction is true unless both its conjuncts are true, so these two conditionals have to be true, but there are three ways to make it conditional true. 3 ways to make a disjunction true, 2 ways to make a biconditional true. There's only one way to make a negation true, to make a negation false. This is the conclusion. We're trying to make it false, which is, of course, to have true to what's being negated. So we must have true for either P or Q. So our hand is not forced here, except if you look at the left conjunct here, it says, if P is true, then Q is true. Now, to get false for this negation, we must have true for what's inside the parentheses, which means one of them has to be true. Either P has to be true, or Q has to be true, or they're both true. Well, now suppose P is true. Well, then we'd have a true antecedent here, and so we must have a true consequent. So if P is making that disjunction true, then Q will also make it true, because if P is true, Q is true from the left conjunct of the first premise. So Q's got to be true either way. If P is true, Q's true, and if P is false, to keep the T here, we must have true. So we know that Q is true. Q has to be true either way. If P is true, it has to be true, and if P is false, it has to be true. Because of this says if P then Q, and that says either P or Q. Well, if Q is true, R is true, right? And if R is true, then the left disjunct, of 2 is false. So if R is true, not R is false. Well, a true disjunction with a false left disjunct must have a true right disjunct. So not S must be true, so S must be false. If S is false, T must be false. Because a biconditional is true only when the sentences share the same truth value. And now what about P? Well, it doesn't matter. We could assign P true, or we could assign P false. And so there are 2 invalidating assignments for this sequence. True, 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 false, false, and false, true, true, false, false. And here, although we weren't forced, because of the connection between the false conclusion and the true left conjunct to the first premise, we could infer that Q is going to have to be true either way, whatever truth value P takes. So there'll be two of these invalid sequence where you have to find an invalidating assignment, an assignment where all the premises are true and yet the conclusion is false. And that's what will be on the in-class writing test, which will take up the last half hour or so of class.